Hello everyone, welcome to the Bridge Cultures. My name is Virginia and I am a volunteer from ISIC. Today we are going to have a special guest that he's from Hawaii. But first I would like to tell you about the activity. The Bridge Cultures is a series of information lectures about different cultures around the world based in the consciential paradigm. We research about Holocaust to understand more about the country, about the identity of the people that live there. And we study too the challenges for the intermissives to live in that country. So today, as I was telling you before, we have Michiko Ferraioli. She's from Hawaii, and she's going to tell us a lot of things about this interesting nation. So I'm going to invite her in a minute. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Bridge Cultures. So, aloha, Michiko. Welcome to the Bridge Cultures.
Aloha, Virginia, and thank you to everyone joining us today.
Okay, I would like to mention some a biography about Michiko. So Michiko was born and raised in Hawaii. And in 2011, she moved to Brazil to live with her partner, Fernandez, who is in Brazilian. And today he's here with us too. and there she started studying conscientiology at the IIPC in São Paulo and taking courses at ISIC in Foz do Iguaçu. In 2015, Michiko moved to Australia to continue their self-research and explore international work. Michiko has a bachelor's degree in political science, master's degree in business administration, and is the co-author of the article Theoretical and Practical Approach to Performing International Work in Conscientiology through the establishment and sustainment of conscientiology roots. And today, she's a volunteer as us in ISIC, working on translations and website development, and she's co-coordinator of the Bridge Book Club. So, welcome, Michiko. Well, I invite you all, people who are watching us at YouTube, that you can ask questions in every moment, and you can interact with us all the time. Okay, so Michiko, please be free and start the presentation.
Thank you, Virginia. Very grateful for everyone's presence and also this opportunity to share with you a little bit about Hawaii's culture and a little bit about my experiences there from the lens of the consciential paradigm. So the consciential paradigm, according to our dictionary, is defined as a leading theory of conscientiology based on the consciousness itself and its attributes. It's a reference system or a scientific model which allows for a broader study and understanding of the consciousness, or UNI, based on its bioenergetic, holosomatic, multidimensional, and multi-existential reality. There was recently a lecture in English for the Bridge Talks on the consciential paradigm. So if you would like to learn more about this topic, I definitely encourage you to listen to the presentation on ISIC's YouTube channel. And I've also provided the link there. So I think it's important to note that not only is this research or this presentation given from this reference point, it's also based on my personal experiences and opinions, which of course may differ from others. So it's important for everyone listening to this presentation to use the principle of disbelief And that is, do not believe in anything, including what is presented here. Experiment and have your own experiences. So come to your own conclusions, dispute, let's have a debate, share your ideas, and in that way we can build upon this initial research together. So what are the objectives today? Why study the cultural holothosine and holokarma of a nation, and here specifically of Hawaii? One of the objectives is to understand the facilitating factors and difficulties of the intermissivists when they are reborn or residing in the place, and also to help reflect on and establish the initial hypothesis regarding the holokarmic responsibility with the culture. So, using a scientific approach, the problem we want to solve is, or what we want to investigate is, what is the holokarmic balance of Hawaii? Is it positive or negative? This is something that's quite difficult to derive a conclusion on, particularly when it's in the initial phase of a research. But I do have an original hypothesis that Hawaii is in the recomposition phase, with more credits in the egokarmic phase and working on the credits of the group karma. And they haven't yet arrived at working on polykarmic credits to become more positive. So let's explore this further, and I would like to have a discussion about your thoughts and perceptions. Okay, so the methodology being used here is from lived experiences. So my experiences growing up in Hawaii, analysis of data from observational data, which is observed of the culture by myself and others who have also lived there or who have been there. Self-experimental data, so with myself as the guinea pig within the culture, and compiled data of the demographics and the history of Hawaii. For this particular presentation, you will see that I used a lot of visuals, including photos and videos, and that is an idea that came to me as being important to connect with and understand the holothosine of Hawaii. So I invite you all to please feel free to connect with the holothosine and share your perceptions and paraperceptions throughout the presentation. And again, we are using the methodology through the lens of the consciential paradigm. So first off, I'd like to start off with clarifications of frequently asked questions. The first one is, isn't Hawaii part of the US? So when we're talking about the holokarma of nations, why are we talking about Hawaii as a separate culture? So yes, Hawaii is a state of the United States of America, but here we distinguish its culture from the US culture because it became part of the US relatively recently in 1959, although it was annexed in 1898, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so it doesn't have, in my opinion, such a long historical Thosenic connection with the US, and also being geographically isolated from the rest of the world. It has, in my opinion, retained a lot of its distinct characteristics of its culture. And I also think it's interesting to study Hawaii, the history and culture, through this lens of the consciential paradigm. So the second question I would like to address is one considered Hawaiian if they were born in Hawaii? So, for example, would I be considered Hawaiian? Now, from the conscientiological point of view, I'm a consciousness, of course, but in regards to this intraphysical or current manifestation, the question is, would I be Hawaiian? Or am I Japanese, Korean, American, Australian? It's actually all of these, right? Depending on whether you're talking about where I was born, where I hold my citizenship, my ancestry, and other things. But literally, I guess, strictly speaking, I would not be considered Hawaiian in Hawaii, as Hawaiian typically refers to the native Hawaiians or the indigenous people and their descendants of the Hawaiian Islands. So while I was born and raised in Hawaii, I'm not actually considered Hawaiian. Rather, I am called Kama'aina, or a local from Hawaii. So in this context, Hawaii refers to the place. And when we speak of Hawaii's culture, I'm referring to the culture that characterizes the holothosing of the place and its habitants, which includes the Hawaiian or Native Hawaiian culture and people. So I hope that's not too confusing, but oftentimes people will say, "Oh, you know, you're Hawaiian, you're from Hawaii," and in Hawaii, I would definitely not be considered Hawaiian in this context. So the next question is, what is the correct pronunciation of Hawaii? So you'll hear me saying Hawaii. That's the correct pronunciation. In Brazilian Portuguese, it's a little bit similar, right? Hawaii, we usually say. In English, you will hear people pronounce it as Hawaii or Hawaii. But the closest to the correct pronunciation is Hawaii or Hawaii. The last question is, how many islands does Hawaii comprise of? This might be surprising. If it was a bit interactive, I would ask you if anyone wants to take a guess how many islands there are. But since I can't hear anyone, I'll just move on. There are 130 islands in the Hawaiian archipelago. Here's a picture of that. And we have 8 major islands. So you probably are familiar with the 8 major islands, but there are actually over 130 islands. Today, we'll talk briefly about each of the 8 major islands, and I'll give 1 or 2 interesting facts about each island, because they do have their own characteristics, which is quite interesting. So Hawaii is quite geographically isolated, being about 3,000 kilometers from the nearest continent, spreading over 2,400 kilometers from the most northwestern islands to the most southeastern islands. So typically, each island is essentially a submerged volcanic mountain, and the formation is with the oldest islands being in the north. And then as the tectonic plates moved over the hot spots, you have the younger islands to the south. So Kauai, which is one of the oldest islands in our 8 major islands, is about 6 million years old. And then the Big Island, the last island here, is about 700,000 years old. And it is still growing because there's active volcanoes there, creating new land. And beyond this island, there is also an undersea volcano that has been active since 1996. And it will eventually emerge in about 10,000 to 100,000 years from now. So it is still growing, the islands. All right, and now so just to show you from a Google Earth perspective, again, really interesting how the tectonic plates move over the hot spots and create these volcanic islands. So here we are, as you can see, pretty isolated from the rest of the continents. And here we have the 8 major islands. So the first and oldest is Kauai. It's called the Garden Isle because of the tropical rainforest covering most of its surface. It has very high cliffs and is very green and lush with waterfalls. It maintains a lot of imminent energy because of this, and because there's not a big population living there. So Mount Waialae is also referred to as one of the wettest spots on Earth due to the annual average rainfall of about 10,000 millimeters. The next island we have is Ni'ihau. There's a population of about 170, And this island is referred to as the Forbidden Island. It was purchased in 1864 by a Scottish farmer, Elizabeth Sinclair. She bought it from the Hawaiian Kingdom for $10,000 US. Her descendants, the Robinson family, continue to own the island, and that is why it's called the Forbidden Isle, because you must be invited to the island. The residents who do live here, the primary language on this island is Hawaiian. An interesting fact about this island is that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese fighter pilot crashed on this island and was helped by the residents there who were of Japanese descent. However, he was later assassinated by some other Native Hawaiian residents, or I should say other Hawaiian residents. Okay, the next island is Oahu, and this is where the state capital of Honolulu is located. So the town I grew up in is Mililani, in the middle of the island. And later on, I moved to Waikiki. So that's a very famous tourist destination. So most of the culture that I talk about and the demographics will be about this main island, as most of the population lives there. Okay, the next island is Molokai. Molokai has a population of about 7,500 and is often called the Friendly Island. Life here is very slow, relaxed, rural. It's very traditional. The people are very friendly. It's also the location, if you see in this bay area here, is surrounded by these large cliffs. And in this area here, in this valley, was it was a former colony where patients who had Hansen's or leprosy disease were exiled there during the 1960s. So when they, I guess, they allowed the patients, they developed vaccinations and everything. So they allowed and they understood, I guess, leprosy better, Hansen's disease better. So they actually opened up the colony, but the residents there, the patients there, decided to stay. And many of them had families there, and they lived there to this day. So Fernandez and I were fortunate enough to visit this colony. The only way to access it is if you hike down the cliffs or the mountains. So you can either ride a mule or you can walk. So I'm not sure if you all can see this, but there's basically switchbacks that go back and forth, zigzag through the mountain. So it starts at the top and then it goes all the way down here around the bay into the valley to the colony. And interesting, as we were walking down this area, there were people who were running past us, and apparently the workers and the volunteers there, they run up and down this trail twice a day, basically, to get down to the village and go back up. So the next island is Lanai. Lanai is one of the smallest islands and is majority owned by an American businessman, Larry Ellison, who is the founder of Oracle. It's about 29 kilometers wide, and it was once the world's largest pineapple plantation. So as you can see, it's quite dry, and there's a lot of soil erosion. It's also the location of Shipwreck Beach, where ships have been grounded or they get stuck accidentally on the beach. And sometimes some of these shipwrecks were done intentionally. I'm not sure why. So that's the site of Shipwreck Beach there. The next island is Maui. It's the second largest island of the Hawaiian Islands and has diverse landscapes due to its unique geology, climate, and topography. It also has the highest peak, volcanic Haleakala. So as you can see, this is a picture here of Haleakala, and it's quite high. It's above the clouds and has a very unique soils here, volcanic soils. All right, Kaho'olawe is 115 square kilometers. It's the smallest of the 8 main islands. And for such a small island, it actually went through quite a difficult evolution. So first it was used as a penal colony where they sent criminals and prisoners. Then it was used for cattle and sheep ranching, which, as you can see, had some negative impacts on the environment of the island. And then it was used by the US Navy for bombs and arms testing after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this was going on for quite a while by the US military until the Native Hawaiians started protesting and requested that stop. And in 1990, that was ended, and the US military basically said, here, people of Hawaii, you can have your island back. However, it was now full of bombs and unexploded ordnance, so nobody could actually live there or do anything on the island as it was very dangerous. So what happened then was a memorandum of understanding between the US Navy and the state of Hawaii established an objective to clean up the island and make it habitable for the people of Hawaii to use. So the US Navy then started awarding contracts for the clearance of unexploded ordnance from the island. And that project lasted for about 7 years. It took 7 years to clean up the island. And this was a project that I worked on from 1998 to 2004. The island of Hawaii, or the Big Island. So this is the youngest and biggest of the islands. Here is where you can find Hawaii's more active volcanoes, Mauna Loa and Kilauea. This photo is when Fernandez and I went to the Big Island in 2015, and we were able to see the active or recent lava flow from Kilauea, which is one of the active volcanoes. So Kilauea is here on the east side of the island. And in the crater, there's actually a lake forming. It's considered one of the hottest lakes in the world. And really interesting, Google will show you the remnants of the lava flows from the different eras when it was erupting. And this is the other volcano, Mauna Loa. I believe the last time it actually erupted was 1984, I believe, but it's still considered an active volcano, and the possibility for future eruptions are still very much possible. Okay. And on the Big Island, there's also Mauna Kea. This one's a dormant volcano, and it's when it's measured from its base underwater, it's actually the highest mountain in the world. It contains glaciers and 13 telescopes from around the world. The conditions for space exploration on the top of Mauna Kea is very good due to there being very little pollution or no pollution in the air, as well as very little light pollution. So in the nearest city, which is Hilo, they all use very low lights. So it's quite difficult to drive at night, actually, on this island, because they don't want the lights to interfere with the telescopes here. Okay. So the 8 major volcanic islands of Hawaii located slightly below the Tropic of Cancer, which contributes to the relatively mild climate. So summer months will average around 84 degrees Fahrenheit or 29 degrees Celsius, while winter months average about 79 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. It's very common to have a weather forecast for the whole week where every day the temperature highs and lows are exactly the same. But surprisingly, depending on where you are, you can experience very hot, dry, desert-like conditions, as well as cold, snowy conditions. And there are occurrences of tropical storms and more rarely hurricanes. The Hawaiian Islands are also subject to many earthquakes, typically due to volcanic activity, and therefore there's also the threat of tsunamis. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Hawaii, mainly focusing on particular milestones that I think have influenced Hawaii's holothusi. So Hawaiian Islands were first settled by the Polynesians. According to recent radiocarbon dating, most likely they settled there around 1000 AD or Common Era, and they came from the Marquesas Islands. The original settlers were very highly skilled navigators, farmers, and fishermen who brought with them crops and seeds and animals. Because due to Hawaii's geographic isolation, the actual chance of a natural introduction of a seed or a sapling arriving and being able to survive on the Hawaiian Islands was actually extremely rare. So it was said that these first settlers live in isolation and relative peace for about 500 years, with the last wave of migration arriving in the Hawaiian Islands, most likely from Tahiti. So the second set of, I guess, migrants, we could call them, was likely from Tahiti. And for some reason that nobody could really explain, after that, there was no further migrations. So these second settlers, they came with their religions and their beliefs. They built temples. They had a caste society, as well as a legal system with rules or taboos called kapus, and a multi-god or polytheistic religion that worship different gods, including a god of war. So there was also this concept, I thought this was quite interesting, that they had a concept of what they called mana. And mana is, it's a type of energy that exists in objects and people. So what they perceived as this energy was, it was an energy of power. And what they believed was that this mana could be accumulated from others through certain acts of war and ritualistic sacrifices and other acts. So there was a time when this struggle for more mana or power and more land led to quite fierce battles and wars among the Hawaiian rulers on each island. And fighting and wars actually became a way of dispute resolution. So it was quite a time of violence and in that time. So by the 18th century, battles using weapons fashioned of wood and stones were kind of at the peak on the Hawaiian Islands. And that was around the time when in 1776, Captain Cook was on an expedition. He was trying to find a northwest passage and landed on the island of Kauai in 1778. So when he landed, some people say that the Hawaiians thought that he was one of the Hawaiian gods. And so they paddled out on their canoes to greet him. And they offered him and his crew food and gifts. At that point, Cook, from his explorations, knew the Hawaiians were not immune to the diseases his men carried. And he tried to prevent contact with the Hawaiian people, but unfortunately he was unsuccessful. And this resulted in the spread of diseases to the islanders, as well as some violence. So the islanders began to steal items from his ships, and that was kind of the start of, once they were able to gain iron and some of the weapons from the ships, they were then able to kind of now fight their wars with actual weapons and guns and things like this. So he left Kauai. He was an explorer first and foremost. So he left Kauai to continue his expedition, but they eventually made their way back to the islands as they were running low on supplies. So this time, Captain Cook arrived on the Big Island. So he arrived on another island, and he was greeted by 15,000 Hawaiians who gave him gifts and praise, and they honored him as a great chief. So Cook noted in his diaries, however, how quickly the disease was spreading throughout the islands. So he left once again, but was forced back due to a storm. So this time, when he came back to the Big Island, the Hawaiians were not very welcoming. Basically, him and his crew had overstayed their welcome and depleted a lot of their food and supplies. So they began stealing things from his ship. And what happened was Captain Cook, he tried to hold one of the chiefs hostage, and this ended in his death. So they ended up assassinating Captain Cook on Kealakekua Bay on the Big Island. One of the chiefs at that time, who then became King Kamehameha I, he was quite interested in the information that Cook had with regards to military tactics, Western knowledge of technology, and he took this knowledge and he used it. And when there was subsequent trading with British and American traders, he would trade things for their arms and weapons. And his aim at the time was to conquer all of Hawaii. So he succeeded in 1810 after a very fierce battle on the island of Oahu, and he then established the Kingdom of Hawaii. Shortly after that, he actually fell ill, and one of his favorite wives, Queen Ka'ahumanu, although she did not become the ruling queen, she was very clever and very well respected among the Hawaiians. So she gained a lot of power. And what happened after the death of King Kamehameha I was that she played a significant role in actually abolishing the kapu system. So the historical records say that one of the kapus was that Hawaiian women and men could not eat together in the same room. But one day she invited King Kamehameha II to eat with her publicly. Therefore, in that one act, ending the whole kapu system, and with that, their whole religious system of multi-gods. So that was quite a significant thing that happened in Hawaiian history. Basically, at this time in 1819, if you can imagine, they were practicing this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, they didn't have their system of law, and they had no religion. So it was at this time that the Christian missionaries arrived. So they didn't have any knowledge that King Kamehameha had died. And they didn't have any knowledge that basically the Hawaiian religion was abolished. So they came at this time offering this new religion to the Hawaiians. Okay, so I think we have a question here. Yes.
Yes, we have a question. We have people participating. They are thank you for the presentation. We have a comment, and I'm going to put, but you are talking right now the history, and there's a question about which diseases did Cook's crew bring to the natives? You can.
Yeah, so they had cholera, influenza, so the flu, mumps, measles, and whooping cough, and I'm not sure what else, but yeah, all of those diseases basically.
Thank you. Perfect. There was a comment here through Kim McCall. He was saying the question of how long it may take for a cultural Holocene to be overwhelmed by another would be a fascinating study. The USA Holocene seems highly contagious. Okay.
Yes, very, very good comment, Kim. With my research, I actually found the exact same thing, you know, and it would be interesting to maybe do a comparison, you know, of the Native Hawaiian culture with the Aboriginal culture, for example, which you are an expert in. So it would be very interesting to pursue this research topic.
Okay, so we have no more questions, but be free, people, if you want to make another question. So thanks.
Yes. So we continue in 1820 with the Christian missionaries' arrival. And so at this time, it was a time of instability, right? And the Native Hawaiians, I guess, were in a position of, they wanted to know what was next, basically. So here the Christian missionaries arrive with this new religion, and the Hawaiian people were not ready to fully accept a new religion. However, what was interesting here is that they found something that they really wanted. So, and that was a written language. So they went to the churches, but it was for the books, basically. Hawaiians did not originally have a written language. The culture, traditions, and history was orally transmitted. So when American missionaries arrived in the islands in 1820, Hawaiians quickly adopted a written Hawaiian language, and within a year had a literacy rate of 90%. So that is quite significant and interesting in the history of Hawaii. And also this was very much supported by the Hawaiian monarchy, that their people become literate. Which is interesting because there are other countries, there are other instances where the people in power discourage their people from becoming literate, because the more people are educated, you know, they're less susceptible to being manipulated. So this was quite interesting about Hawaiian and their shift. You could actually see that in the beginning, the contact with the foreigners who would arrive, when they did their trading and everything, they wanted to get their arms, they wanted to get iron, they wanted to get weapons, right? And then now they shifted to, they wanted knowledge. They actually perceived that through reading and education, they would be able to gain power that way. There was an interesting story about a young Hawaiian boy, Henry Opukahaya. He escaped Hawaii when he was young, in the midst of one of the wars, and he boarded a ship that was headed to Connecticut, America. And one day in America, he was adopted by one of the missionaries, and he was found sitting on the steps of what was Yale Library at the time, and just crying. And the people asked him, you know, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he just said, there is so much knowledge in this building and so little knowledge in my head. So yeah, it was just an example of how passionate Hawaiians were about learning to read and gaining knowledge. So after the Christian missionaries, after their mission was completed, many of them remained behind on the Hawaiian Islands, and their descendants began to establish plantations. So the missionaries and their descendants realized that they could actually start making a lot of money in Hawaii. And that was the beginning of the sugarcane plantations, the pineapple plantations, and then the immigration from China. So started with the sugarcane plantations, and then the immigration from the different countries to work on the plantations. The missionaries, you could say, they sought more land and more money and power, which many said led to the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, and then Hawaii became annexed by the U.S. So this is a very controversial topic because now we're shifting into when Hawaii actually became a state of the United States. But the legality of how the U.S. became annexed and then a territory is widely contested. The U.S. government actually did issue an official apology and recognizing that the Hawaiian monarchy was illegally overthrown. And that started its incorporation into the U.S. So in 1941, after Hawaii becomes a U.S. territory, and I'm not sure if you can see the photos very well, but this first photo here is the Hawaiian flag being taken down. And this photo here is the American flag being erected. So that signified the U.S., Hawaii becoming part of the U.S. So in 1941, as most of us know, was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And after the Japanese attack, there was kind of there was a sentiment. There was like a patriotic sentiment after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And in particular, I think it's interesting to mention that when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, or after it happened, a lot of the Japanese Americans, so we'll explain the immigration in a bit, but basically by 1820, the majority of the population was made up of Japanese people. So after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a lot of these people were subject to curfews. So on the rest of the United States, the Japanese Americans were put into concentration camps. But in Hawaii, you're talking about the majority of the population. So they couldn't put them in concentration camps, but they did put curfews on them. So the Japanese couldn't leave their house after dark, for example. So that was my grandmother and my mother that experienced that in Hawaii. And to prove their loyalty, there were a bunch of Japanese Americans that formed a volunteer battalion to go off and fight in the World War II, just to prove their loyalty to America. So my uncles joined this 442nd Battalion to go off, and they went to Italy and France, and they fought in the war just to prove their allegiance. So this is kind of the sentiment that was building up after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and that kind of led to what people said, the Hawaii being incorporated as a state to the United States. It was done by vote, and voting is not compulsory in Hawaii, right? In the United States anyway. And many of the people had claimed that it wasn't fair because the question they were asking wasn't worded very clearly, and that a lot of the people who voted were actually military and their families, and transient people who weren't permanent residents of Hawaii. So that, again, very controversial side of the history of Hawaii. So any questions there?
Yes, I have a comment and we have a question. I have a comment for myself. You were talking about the Second World War. And I remember we would talk the other day about this book about the reincarnation. I don't know if you remember, but there's this very famous book. This in Portuguese, a Volta, but now we are going to put the name in English in a minute in the chat. But this is the history of James Houston, that he was a pilot from the Second World War, and he's the Soma in the island of Chichiyama that we discovered is not in the Hawaiian island. It's far away, near Japan. But after his diploma his diploma was in 1944, and then he was reborn in United States. And when he was a child, he remembered all the past life when he was this pilot, James Houston. And the name now, he's alive. The name is James Leninger. He said in this book that he saw his parents in the Royal Hawaiian in Honolulu. He decided to reborn with them. So he recognized in the Hawaiian island, and it's very interesting, this story, because maybe there could be a lot of cases from consciousness that are in the Hawaiian island. So just wanted to share with you guys. And then,
thank you, Virginia. That's really interesting, and I think it would be a good research to further study, past lives in Hawaii, because if you kind of look at the history, and you read certain parts in history about the battles they had in this battle between the Americans and the Native Hawaiians for land throughout the history, you can see such a apparent karmic dynamic there. And, you wonder, like, if these people were then later reborn in Hawaii again for the opportunity to kind of repair and reconcile those karmic relationships. So it's
yes, it makes sense. And do you think you have some relation with this scenario, or with this with the Second World War? Do you have any hypothesis about I don't know, about this content, or did you do something in this life because you were born in which island? What did you do in your professional work? Did you do something related to this?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because before I started studying this topic, I didn't really think about it too much. I didn't make the connections from my life in Hawaii. But speaking about my career there, I actually, every job that I had, or most jobs that I had, I was working in the construction industry. But I often worked on for military contractors, defense contractors. But I noticed that every project that I worked on was actually some kind of restoration or rehabilitation kind of project, as opposed to nuclear projects or anything to do with war or the military. So, for example, as I mentioned before, on Kaho'olawe, I worked on that project to rehabilitate the island and to restore the island so that the Native Hawaiians could go back there and live there and use the island for their purposes. Another job that I worked for was another government contract, and it was to build a museum on Ford Island. that's where Pearl Harbor, Arizona Memorial is located. So we were there to construct a museum to educate people about what happened in the war and about the aviation there. So yeah, I had a few jobs like that where there was another one where we built an administration building for the Department of Hawaiian Homeland, so that they could focus on their work to administer people from the Native Hawaiian community. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think just from that alone, I do think that maybe I have some ties there. And
very interesting.
I needed to do.
Yeah. We have another question here from Gabriela Carniel. Would like to know about, regarding to immanent energy, how do you feel it in Hawaii? What's the difference between other places you've been in the world?
Hi, Gabby. That's a really good question. I was telling Virginia the other day that it's actually when we were talking about, the challenges and the facilitating factors of growing up in Hawaii, is one of the benefits is the access to immanent energy. So funny enough, I didn't really realize it until I left Hawaii. So for me, I didn't necessarily feel it growing up. I didn't realize it, but I could tell you that I was very connected to the ocean, very much so. That was very much a part of my life, and I always felt really good about being there and everything. But again, I didn't realize how good it was to, how rejuvenating it was to live in a place like Hawaii with all of the access to that. Until I moved from Hawaii, I went to Sao Paulo. Okay. So Sao Paulo is a very dangerous, polluted, crowded. I mean, it has really great aspects as well, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have lived there. But yes, very much so. I felt the impact and the repercussions going from Hawaii to Sao Paulo, Brazil, and being in such a large city. I did feel the repercussions, and it did actually manifest physically as well. And so it was really good that Fernandez had taught me how to do the vibrational state when I first moved there. And later on, we had access to more nature where I could rejuvenate my energies. But yeah, definitely I could feel the difference there. And then moving to Australia again, from Sao Paulo to Australia, very different.
Do you have a hypothesis why you were born in Hawaii?
I do. It's very initial at this stage, but I do think that I had some reconciliations to do there with my group karma. I do notice a connection and traces of traits of Hawaii that I learned to, I eventually had the opportunity to recycle, and then I moved to another country, and then I could continue working on that. And then also, I think that's it. I needed to do some self recycling and also some reconciliations with my group karma there.
Very nice. Now we are two questions that they are very similar from Pamela and Anna. I can solve. How can you describe the Holocene of the Hawaii? I think you are going to tell. I remember we have 35 minutes, okay? And another is Anna Reed, the same, how you define Hawaii Holocenity. So yes. If you want to tell right now, or if you want to continue just the history, because I think this is gonna, and then talk about this, be free. what you want.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the questions, Anna and Pamela. So I'll just finish. We're done with the history, but maybe we'll move on because it kind of builds up to understanding the Holothosine. So again, we had the native Hawaiians that were already living here. Here's a photo of some of the people who made flower leis. So this is something very symbolic in Hawaii. And then we had the wave of immigrations. Okay, so the first wave of immigrants were from Asian, Chinese and Japanese. Chinese were first, and then the Japanese followed after that to work on the plantations, and then the Portuguese and the Filipinos. So what's interesting to note here is that this wave, the first wave, they came under labor contracts. So some of them came just by themselves without their families, intending to just work on the plantations for the contract and then go back to their home country. And then some of the people actually brought all of their families with them. So after they worked on the plantation, they actually remained there and they established themselves. So you can see back then when they first came, and then how they brought different aspects of their culture to Hawaii. So the Portuguese, interesting. I researched that because they were Europeans, for some reason they were seen as more respected and educated or whatever it was. But for some reason they became kind of the supervisors on the plantations. That was very common. And here we have a dish called Portuguese bean soup. And it's very similar to feijoada in Brazil, I thought. It's a little bit different, but this Portuguese influence. So the next wave of immigrants from Okinawa, Korea, and Puerto Rico, they actually came after the Organic Act, which ended contract labor. So they were free to come here and just, settle in, and they could establish their own businesses, which they did so quite successfully. And again, they brought their culture, which is very prevalent and popular in Hawaii. So just a little bit about the language. As I mentioned, the oral tradition was the original language of Hawaii. It was evident in the hula dance, their chants, and their songs. And it was actually banned in the 1890s after the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, along with the hula. The hula was not allowed. The Christian missionaries, they felt that it was too sexual and seductive, and they actually banned the Native Hawaiians from practicing hula. And with respect to the Hawaiian language, that ban was only officially lifted in 1986. So growing up in schools, and then it became an official language in Hawaii, along with English. So in school, we learned both languages. The Hawaiian language only has 13 letters in the Hawaiian alphabet, 5 vowels, 8 consonants, and a glottal stop called the okina. What's interesting to note here is, so you have all of these, you have the Native Hawaiians, you have the missionaries who speak English, and then you have the Native Hawaiians, and you have the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and all of the other plantation workers who speak a little English. So they had to find a way to communicate with each other. And it was interesting because they didn't just stay with their groups. They actually integrated with each other and wanted to talk to each other. So what ended up happening is they created a Hawaii, like a Creole English. It's called Hawaiian Pidgin. And I'm sure this is common in other countries as well. But Hawaiian Pidgin is commonly spoken in Hawaii until today. And I think it's just an interesting fact to understand the collective culture of Hawaii, and being part of a community and kind of like a melting pot of different cultures. Okay, so just quickly about the demographics. The total population today of Hawaii is about 1.4 million. Asians make up the majority of the population. And also Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, 143,549. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but the Native Hawaiians, after the arrival of Captain Cook, they estimated the numbers, I believe, at the most, there were 250,000. And with the diseases, the population actually decreased more than 50%. So that was quite very sad. But throughout the years, the Native Hawaiians, they rebounded. And today their population, along with other Pacific Islanders, are about 143,000. Mixed race, 24.2% of the population, and that increases. And that's another interesting fact because, for example, I am from Korean and Japanese background, and previous generations from Japan and from Korea, they would be quite surprised with that combination, because if my father were back in Korea and my mother was back in Japan, they may have never met. And even if they did meet, they would probably be arch enemies because of the war and their history of the two countries. So something like that was quite rare there. But here in Hawaii, it was very, interracial marriages were very common here in Hawaii.
I think we have a question that is related to what you are talking right now. Could you talk about your Japanese background? You have talked about your parents. I don't know if you want to say something about your past lives, maybe, or not.
Yeah, that's another thing I have to study. That's another research topic. But I'm very much connected to my Japanese background. I enjoy the foods, the language, the culture very much. I love traveling to Japan. And what's interesting is growing up in Japan post-World War II, and the American influence started to become quite strong. And when I was going to school, middle school, I went to a school that had a lot of military families, so a lot of American military families. And we actually felt, for myself and maybe some of my friends, we tried to suppress that Japanese culture side of us, and we wanted to be more Americanized, so we didn't really interact with our culture a lot, and that was really sad. So it wasn't until I moved from Hawaii and I lived in other countries that I really wanted to connect back with that side, that side of me. So that was interesting side story.
Okay.
And then education, 91.8% are high school graduates or higher, 32.5% have a bachelor's degree or higher. Education is very much valued in Hawaii. Median household income in 2018 was $78,000. Interesting here, the unemployment rate pre-COVID was quite low, 3%, the lowest in the United States. But post-COVID, it is 12.5%. So, and you can imagine why that is, because Hawaii's economy is based on tourism mostly and some military spending. Hawaii's health, so life expectancy is quite high, over 81 years of age. That's the highest in the US. We have a low prevalence of obesity, low levels of air pollution, low level of frequent mental distress, and the state ranks 3rd among the states for senior health and 7th for the health of women and children. Some of the challenges that we face are low immunization for certain illnesses among adolescents, and we have a high prevalence of excessive drinking and high incidence of salmonella. In the past 5 years, diabetes has increased from 7.8% to 10.9% of adults. And I think that's a reflection, of the diet, American diet, but also we'll talk about Hawaii. We can't blame it all on the American diet because food has always been a very big part of the Hawaiian culture. So I wish I could have someone pronounce this for me, just to have a go at it. So our state fish is the humu humu nuku nuku apua'a, very colorful, and I love this slide here because it really shows the different colors. That really is a symbol of Hawaii. We are called the Hawaii Aloha State, but we're also called the Rainbow State because it's so colorful, our biodiversity, also our multiculturalism. So that's very much symbolic of Hawaii. Interesting thing about pineapples, it's a symbol of Hawaii, but Fernandez and I once went on a tour at one of the old Hawaiian pineapple plantations, and we found that the pineapples actually came from Brazil. So I thought that was pretty interesting. State motto of Hawaii is Ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono, and that translates to the life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. So I put these words here in bold because they also very much demonstrate kind of the holothosing of Hawaii as well. So we'll go through that. Interesting here is the Hawaiian flag. So members of the monarchy had close ties with the British, actually. So they honored them by putting the Union Jack, which is the flag of the United Kingdom. And then the 8 stripes here symbolize the 8 major islands and the red, white, and blue of the American flag. State dance hula. So again, I told you that at one time the hula was banned because it was seen as seductive and too sexual. But let me see if I can, oops, sorry, just show you a snippet of the hula. So that's the female, and this is at the Merry Monarch. Merry Monarch is a huge hula festival that they have every year on the Big Island of Hawaii, and all of the hula groups come to compete in this competition. Okay, so that's the hula. All right, so biodiversity, I won't have time to go through all of this, but it's important to note that over 25,000 unique species, making Hawaii one of the most biologically diverse areas of the planet. Sadly, Hawaii now has the highest extinction rate per square mile on the Earth, or per square kilometer on the Earth. And this little guy here, he's a wallaby, and his ancestors are from Australia. So what happened is there was a couple of wallabies that were brought over from Australia and were in one of our zoos, and they ended up escaping, those lucky people, and they established their own colony in our mountains in Hawaii. So we have a colony of wallabies there. Wallabies are similar to kangaroos, by the way. Okay. Next slide. So just real quickly.
Michiko, I would like to ask you something. Very interesting, the hula with a lot of energy, and the places you saw, the energy in Hawaiian is very nice, the place, the beach. So all the things. And I wonder, why do you move to another country? Because Hawaii has a lot of beautiful things. Don't you think
Yes.
you can have something to do there or not? Well, explain me more, please.
Yes, good question, Virginia. And believe me, I get asked this question all the time. Why in the world would you leave Hawaii? And really interesting. I had a really good life there. And I worked hard. I think I was meant to be there for my preparatory stage of life, my preparation for my pro-access. And I got to the point where, I was pretty organized and self-sufficient and everything. In fact, life was so good. I was very comfortable there. I was very happy. And, one day I just had this thought come to me, like, there's got to be more than life than this, And I explain it like it was just this innate idea that I wasn't supposed to stay there in this comfortable, happy bubble, and I had always loved traveling. I did so throughout my career. And so, yeah, I just had this innate idea that I needed to move from there.
Okay, thank you. We have some comments here. Fernandez saying, my feeling is that they are very well integrated. As Michiko says, he has Japanese and Korean background, which is uncommon everywhere else. Someone saying that Ana Paula, beautiful dance. Yes, really strong energy. Someone is saying, I'm not fighting people. I love that. I love hula dance, my friend, but I need to be able to attend the Merry Monarch one day.
Yeah. I always tell Fernandez he needs to study if he had a past life in Hawaii because his connection is quite strong there as well.
We have here a question just to close this part. What is the level of the Marcelo Pires? What is the level of integration of these diverse immigration groups?
Yeah, Marcela. So as Fernandez mentioned, it is quite integrated, and hopefully we'll have time to go over a little bit more about that in the presentation as well. So if I don't answer your question, please let me know at the end.
Let's see. So
yes. So values. So it's important to mention that these are the values of Hawaiian culture, but it's something that the Hawaiian people, the people of Hawaii, they want to attain, but it's not necessarily that everybody has these. I guess it manifests these values, right? We're still consciousness and evolution, right? But it's definitely values that they aspire to. And it's pretty common across all of the cultures once you've been living in Hawaii for some time. So compassion for others, humility, this idea of perpetuating traditions, to know, to feel, to understand, assist, privilege, responsibility, stand firm, resilience, many hands working together, this idea of community, agreement, thank you, mahalo. You've heard of this word. It means thank you, but it could also be apologetic. Malama means caring, nurturing others, also protecting, and mostly protecting your ohana or your family unit. And pono, right, good, moral, fair, just. So these are just some of the values of Hawaii. Okay, so here we get to the whole thosing of Hawaii's culture. And here, why the rainbow? So I think I kind of explained it, but it really helps me to connect with the holotosing every time I see a rainbow. And actually, Hawaii is referred to as the rainbow state, not only because of its multitude of cultures, but it also actually has a high incidence of rainbows in Hawaii due to its climate and the conditions there. But it has a complexity to it. So Hawaii and its people are not black and white in their thinking. And there are paradoxes, there's peculiarities, and studying its holothosing can be difficult because, when you think about a situation and you say, well, what would what would the people of Hawaii do, or what is the culture? And it's kind of like every question ends in depends, it depends. So one of the paradoxes that I found is that although it is a very quite integrated community, there's a lot of diversity, right? There's a lot of diversity of cultures and thinking and religions. But you find that after a while, after living there for a while, that it's actually quite homogenous, and that living there after a while, you start to conform. You really start to conform. And part of it is because I think it's such a small community, such a small population. And also because we are geographically isolated. So yeah, there's diversity, but on the other hand, it's kind of homogenous. The main aspects of the Holothosine, in my opinion, is that Hawaii is a very collective society, especially when it comes to the family and one's closer group karma. So due to the cost of living and other factors, it's quite common for Hawaii residents to never move from their hometown, or living with or moving back to live with their parents in their parents' house. I guess you could say this is part of the collective Holothosine. I'm not sure, but people do not honk their horn when they're driving unless there's going to be an accident. Don't honk your horn unless there's going to be an accident, or you will scare people, because it's just not done. It's considered rude and just too disruptive. So people kind of get along, and it's quite funny because sometimes it can go a little bit overboard. Like, for example, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo anyway, I don't know about the other cities, but if you're a pedestrian, you yield to cars, right? They're not going to stop for you to cross the street. However, in Hawaii, they not only stop to let you cross the street, but the pedestrians will say, no, you can go. And then they'll be standing there across from each other and like, you go. And then you both try to go and then you don't go, So it's quite funny. But they're very considerate of others in that way. During the COVID shutdown, I spoke to many people who still live there, and they actually all came together to really support local businesses and restaurants. So as much as unemployment was 12.5%, they still used what money and what means they had to support local businesses and restaurants. So I thought that was very symbolic of Hawaii's culture. Sometimes I think Hawaii's importance on collectiveness can be more group karma focused. And again, I think it's also reinforced by its geographical isolation from the world. But on the other hand, Hawaii is also a global tourist destination. So, you can visit Hawaii, and in that small community, or in that small island, or wherever you are in Hawaii, you can experience like 100 different types of cuisines, languages, cultures, activities. So it's quite an interesting place to be. However, after a while, you'll notice that kind of there's a holothosenic pressure to join the collective and conform to its customs. For sure, it's a type of respect, I guess, especially respect for the land, but also respect for the people and respect for the native and indigenous culture is quite strong in Hawaii. So I have customs, superstitions, and mystical. So, for example, with customs, for example, you never enter into somebody's house with your shoes on. You don't wear shoes, outdoor shoes in the house. You don't take anything from the land. So if you remember, I talked a little bit about how the Native Hawaiians believe that mana, or the life energy force, lives in objects. It's the same thing, and it's part of the land, right? So you don't take it with you. And a lot of people want to take the volcanic or lava rocks with them as souvenirs, and they don't know. But they have this superstition that if you take it, you'll be cursed, and you'll have bad luck. So interestingly enough, the Hawaii Post Office, they receive on average in 1 year, they received about 100 rocks per month, being mailed back to them from around the world, from just one of the national parks in Haleakala. So yeah, it's quite pervasive.
Okay, I think you answered for the question of Pamela. That was. Thanks.
Yes. There are also temples there. They're called heiaus, and they're considered sacred, and they have been preserved. So people are not allowed to enter into some of those heiaus, and basically, they've preserved that holothosing of those certain places that they considered sacred. One of the places considered sacred is Mauna Kea, where all the telescopes are. So every time that they want to implement a new telescope on Mauna Kea, there's a huge protest, because there are places where people consider that they are sacred and you shouldn't be going there or developing, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so and then there are other customs that I think sometimes some of these customs are really great. They're really interesting. They're a lot of fun, but it can sometimes happen where you get trapped, entangled in kind of these relationships of guilt and obligation. So, for example, if someone invites you to a wedding, even if you get married 10 years later or your children gets married or whatever, you should invite them to yours or your family's wedding. It's just, the custom. If they give you a gift, you should give a gift of the same amount or, similar. So there's this practice and expectation of reciprocity. And so when it becomes a little bit one-sided, the relationship could end badly or end up with some resentment, or one can become also the subject of gossip among the group. So that's one of the other things that I've noticed. Having such a small population where everybody kind of knows everybody's business, there's a large amount of intraphysical gossip and maybe extraphysical, but from my observations, intraphysical gossip. People from Hawaii love to what we call talk story, or have casual conversations, and which more often than not, that involves some sort of gossip. Accumulation. Hawaii people tend to accumulate a lot of things. And although I'm told that nowadays with the concept of minimalism, Marie Kondo's concept of sparking joy by only keeping the things that spark joy with you, right? And also the improvement in the economic status of the people of Hawaii, coupled with the geographic isolation and the fact that it depends, Hawaii depends on commercial maritime imports for about 80% of its consumer goods are dependent on imports, right? So that I think leads to people stockpiling things for themselves and their family members and their friends and the neighbor who may need it. So imagine with this recent COVID-19 situation, right? And people were panicking and buying toilet paper and storing it. Well, this has been the norm for residents in Hawaii since as long as I can remember. Since I was born, we always had this huge supply of everything. So disorganization, there's a little bit of disorganization. So we have Hawaiian time. I think it's similar to Brazilian time. It's a very relaxed and casual society, and people are not always on time. Sometimes, we live beyond our means, spending more than we can afford on frivolous things, prioritizing work, including the commute time. Hawaii has the worst traffic per capita in the whole nation. And also, prioritizing leisure and things like that. The government actions and processes, lots of bureaucracy, things can be slow. Things can take a while. And I think we have another question.
Yes, we have another question from Viviani Pasos. He's from Sweden.
Yeah.
She lives there. How Hawaii people and government are preparing to face climate change effects?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you saw one of the pictures. Maybe I can go back to it real quickly. So Hawaii is facing huge environmental changes as a result of climate change, right? And for example, the coral bleaching, this is similar to all over the world. All of the world, Australia, a lot of places are having the same situation where the coral is dying off due to climate changes. So one of the things that Hawaii is doing is they have an energy initiative to become 100% renewable energies by the year 2045. So that's a very good thing, a very good initiative. Currently, I think they're at 26%, something like that. And I think they're well on track for that. So, but that's just, that's a long-term solution. And other than that, I'm not sure that all they can do is at the grassroots level, try to educate people and get them to be a lot more environmentally aware. They have a good recycling program. And one of the projects that I worked on in construction as well was to build a boiler to convert rubbish into energy, to be used instead of relying on fossil fuels, for example. Hawaii has a lot of hydro energy and windmill farms, So yeah, they are dealing with it, but I'm not sure. I don't know how prepared they are because climate change is happening quicker than we think, right?
Great. We have time, just 5 minutes, but so I think it
Okay,
would be
maybe
important to talk, about the challenges of intermissivists.
Yeah.
The whole. Okay.
Yep. So coming down to kind of the hypothesis of what is the holokarmic balance of Hawaii. So on the one hand, you had throughout history very fierce battles and warfare. You have traces of this bellicose aspect of the culture. A lot of people say Hawaiians are a fighting culture. It became a norm for them. Like I said, it became how they resolved disputes. They automatically fought with each other. On the other hand, now you have concepts such as ho'oponopono, and they always had this, and it's it's a peaceful, very diplomatic way to resolve resolve conflicts. So they had heavy religious rituals, including sacrifices, environmental degradation from the plantations and also from tourism. This is an interesting one. Throughout my research, I would come across Hawaii being referred to as a strategic location. So strategic location for drug trafficking because there's an easy passage to Asia. Strategic location for gang activities. The Yakuza, the Japanese Yakuza, for example, they blend in very well because of the Japanese residents and tourists, and because real estate with the Japanese is very common. So money laundering through real estate could be hidden, and there's some other examples. And then consumerism and waste, as we adopt more of the capitalist society of American, but also as our own economic position increases, right? We tend to buy more things and then we waste a lot of things. On the other hand, so Hawaii has an internationalization of strong tradists, customs, and practices. So you'll hear around the world this concept of aloha spirit, of taking care of people, of being grateful, of being very accepting and open. It also is a place of energetic rebalance because of its imminent energy. When people go to visit Hawaii, they always say through surveys and whatnot that they feel renewed, they feel refreshed, and they don't exactly know why. I talked about the renewable energy initiatives. They have really good global relations through academic institutions, through well-known global institutions. They're also a very strategic location now for research, especially for the fields of geology, botany, marine science, and so forth. And because of their collective working together, community-minded society, they're also quite good at the consolation tasks. Okay, so again, my initial hypothesis is that Hawaii is in the recomposition phase with respect to its holokarmic balance. So filling up most positive on ego karma and getting there on the positive side with their group karma. Opportunities for the intermissivist, again, immanent energy. It's very open and welcoming to people. I always have a difficult time saying this word in English. Internationalization. So it's a very global destination.
It's okay. Internationalization.
And I think I can say it better in Portuguese for some reason. And personal security. So people, it still has some criminal activity, but for the most part, it's a safe place to live. So you don't have to worry about your security. You can concentrate on other things, right? Some of the challenges I mentioned, there is a holothosenic pressure after a while to conform, especially to the customs and respecting kind of the culture there. You can very much settle into the comfort zone because life is, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's easygoing. It's more relaxed. Again, you have the nature, you have a lot of good weather, so you have a lot of outdoor leisure activities. So life can be really, really good. And the challenge with that is getting stuck in the comfort zone and kind of getting distracted from your pro-access. Another thing is isolation, right? It's quite expensive and it takes a lot of time to travel outside of Hawaii. So if you have family or your, support group outside of Hawaii, you can feel quite isolated, which can also be an opportunity, right? As we are finding out in the COVID environment. High cost of living. So you need to be quite self-organized, especially if you are sole income. You need to be organized with your finances. It's very, very important to be able to live in Hawaii. And with that, if you do organize yourself financially, you have to be careful not to be swept up into materialism and accumulating things. So very much you have to develop your discernment.
Very interesting. I think we could continue debating, but I think it's worth. I'm going to ask one question. Do you think how many intermissivists do you think are in Hawaii? There are a lot. There are not. What do you think about this?
I think there are intermissivists, or at least pre-intermissivists in Hawaii. I definitely felt assistance and a lot of synchronicities while I was living there. And I think that Hawaiian people, people of Hawaii are very open to new ideas. You could see like they had this religion and this established system that in one day they just, got rid of it and let's go on to the new thing, so they're very open. At the same time, they can have this, follow the crowd, follow the trend mentality, but definitely the openness to new ideas. They have a perception of multidimensionality, so the extra physical, they believe in, not believe, but they can perceive consciexes and things like that. So, yeah.
Talking about consciexes, and what do you think about the helpers, extraphysical helpers? Could be any evoluciologists or Serenus in Hawaii or not? What about this?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that, but I definitely, for me personally, my personal experience is I definitely felt assistance there. So I do think there are extra physical consciousness, maybe related to something with the bioenergies. the plant life, the animal life there. Parapsychism, lucid projection, those kind of things. So that's just based on my personal experience.
Okay. Well, I think we are in the end of the presentation. Would you like to finish with something, and then we can present the next culture? Would you like to finish saying what would you like to share with us for the end?
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Mahalo, right? Mahalo to everybody. Mahalo to you, Virginia, to ISIC, to the Bridge Project. Thank you for this opportunity. It's really great.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for your presence here today. It was a pleasant. Mahalo, Michiko. It was a excellent presentation. I think we learned a lot about the culture of Hawaii. And well, I would like to invite you for the next Bridge Cultures that will be will be held, will be on the 19th of November about multiculturalism with Liliana Alexandre from ISIC. So if you have more information, please contact us in ISIC. We are very happy today to finish with Michiko. Mahalo, and we wait for the next researchers for you. Okay, mahalo everyone. Aloha.
Aloha.